presentation is on neurodiversity and belonging. How many of you are already familiar with like the term neurodiversity? Or like neurodivergent? Okay, cool. Just so that I can get a feeler out. So here's kind of the neurodiversity data. So globally there's an estimated 15 to 20% of the population that's considered to be neurodivergent. 5% ADHD, 1.6% autism, dyspraxia up to 6%, dyslexia up to 10%. And then at BYU specifically, there's around 1,000 students who are neurodivergent. So that's from the UAC, that's their statistics, is around, and this is diagnosed, around 900 students with ADHD, around 100 students who are autistic, and there's a lot more. One thing that I discovered at BYU that's actually very prevalent is students coming into BYU and then after getting diagnosed with ADHD or being diagnosed with autism. More likely it's self-diagnosed with autism and like really like strongly passionate and like they've done their research, but an autism test can cost upwards of $2,000 or $3,000. And so it's really difficult sometimes for students to get that. For an ADHD testing, the UAC does testing and the Student Health Center does testing. And so there's a lot of opportunities. And right now on the ADHD Club email list, so that's only that have joined the club, we have around 240 students. So yeah, there's a lot of, and then there's also the OCD Club, which on their email list they have around 100 people, and that wasn't included in these statistics. And then in the Autism Discord, I believe there's like around 20 to 40 people. So there are different communities on campus that kind of are based around this. And the Autism Support Group as well, which John Cox does. So what is neurodiversity? This is probably something that you're kind of familiar with. It's neurological diversity. So your brain can have differences in the way that it actually physically looks and physically works, or how it has found out to work. So someone with ADHD might have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. So like the front part of their brain that's in charge of all the executive function and stuff like that is underdeveloped, which means that they have to struggle with that and like figure out how to work through that, and their brain creates shortcuts and works on other things to compensate for that. There's also, I'll explain a little bit more on the next slide kind of what neurodiversity and what neurotypes are, but everyone has a neurotype, whether you're neurotypical, which is just like you fall in the typical realm, autistic, ADHD, Tourette, specific learning disorder, OCD, and then the other thing is it's similar to other kinds of diversity. Yes, everyone has a broad range of where they fall. No one is the exact same brain and works in the exact same way. No one's structure and function are the same, but there are broad categorizations that are helpful to use, and those are these neurotypes. Okay, so what can it look like? Just broadly, generally, it's differences in communication, socialization, sensory processing, and then information and emotion processing. So you probably have noticed that people with ADHD or people who are autistic communicate in different ways, process sensory things in different ways, socialize in different ways, and process information in different ways. And one thing that I've found is that even though it's different from a neurotypical person, a lot of times there's similarities, and people who are neurodivergent both can find community in people who are also neurodivergent, who process things in the same way. And then also there are specific accommodations and ways in which we can encourage belonging and community from kind of the neuromajority, if you will, which is like neurotypical would be the neuromajority, and to neurominorities as well. One big thing is masking as well. So especially at BYU, a lot of these students have gotten this far because they're able to mask. So masking is just kind of working to fit in with the general norm. And so I make a note about it on the next slide, but it's kind of like or later, but it's like that double consciousness. So like you have your own way of doing things and you do it the way that the majority does it so that you can fit in better. And it causes students to work harder when they might not need to. And so that's where things like accommodations can really come in handy for neurodivergent people. And then the next thing is neurodiversity and diagnoses. A lot of times especially for autistic students, the diagnosis is not about having this medical condition or getting medication. It's about like having that self-reassurance and being like, oh, this way in which I've struggled my whole life is not me being lazy, or is not me not trying hard enough, or things like that. It really is that I struggle with this bigger thing, and there's specific help, and being part of the community, I can get the support that I need. So is it a disability? This is a really big question in the neurodivergent and mental health space. So a disability is just defined as something in your life, a kind of core difference that inhibits you in a major way, whether that's school or attention or focus or work or like you being able to feed yourself or whatever it is, it's a significant inhibition. And so there are a lot of ways in which a neurodivergence might be inhibitory and might be stressful, or like for ADHD, it's a lot, for me, I have to spend a lot more energy to concentrate the same amount as a neurotypical person might use, just because of the kind of a constant understimulation. There's also the social model of disability though. So if you were to go into the ADHD club, you would find us all like talking and we're having a good time and our conversation kind of bounces all over the place and we're talking really fast and talking with each other and stuff like that. And you're like, wow, I feel kind of lost. And it's the same thing. So like in a social situation, a neurodivergent person might feel lost or feel like they have to do extra work for a classroom or something like that. And it kind of goes the same way. And so that's the social model of disability. Is fitting in with the dominant neurotype. And there is very much differing viewpoints on, oh, I consider myself as having a disability, or oh, I consider myself that my brain is just different. And this is something that the neurodivergent community as a whole is figuring out, and individuals figure out for themselves if they want to look at it as a superpower, if they want to look at it as, hey, this is something I really struggle with that I just need help with. So there's a very broad spectrum of understanding and viewpoint. One other thing to note is that there's no specific cure for any neurodivergence. So it's not like mental illness where it's like, oh, now I'm kind of over my depressive period. It's something that someone is going to have and both struggle with and benefit from lifelong. So curing neurodiversity is like curing someone's eye color. It's like, or it's like introversion versus extroversion. It's like, yes, there are people who are introverted and they do things one way, and people who are extroverted do things a different way. And we don't have to push anyone into each other's categories. We just understand that that exists and that kind of diversity exists. And then neurodiversity and mental illness, especially because a lot of neurodivergent people like grow up either in families or in like school systems and things like that that don't necessarily understand or don't know how to best support their neurodivergence. A lot of these come with comorbidities. So I have anxiety and depression. I know a lot of my friends here at BYU also struggle with either anxiety or depression. What it is not. A lot of these phrases are kind of phrases that you've heard around and you're probably familiar with. Like, well, everyone's a little ADHD or a little autistic or OCD, when in reality that's just not true. A lot of times we kind of represent it as a spectrum, or it has been in popular thought represented as a spectrum of like, oh, here's like neurotypical and less autistic, and then very autistic, when in reality it's these groups of people are separate, and you can create a whole grouping of people who are autistic and very much separate from the typical neurotype, and then everyone who is specifically with autism, but with other neurodivergences as well. With autism, it's like everyone is part of this separate wheel from the neurotypical wheel, and they have social differences, special interests, repetitions, sensory sensitivities, and all of these other things.
Can I make a note about the slide as well?
Please, yeah.
So, especially with the term spectrum, we hear there are mixed views, particularly in like the medical community, around that spectrum, because historically it has been portrayed in the medical world as a linear spectrum. And some medical professionals and some autistic people still prefer to think of it that way. Mm-hmm. And this is also not to diminish the experiences of those who have greater support needs, who some would classify as very autistic. And if they would prefer, or their caretakers would prefer to use that language, we try to not like push the other spectrum on there. This is more to demonstrate that there are a variety of views, and adding an additional view, particularly in this way, is helpful for understanding the experience of autistic students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely a really important thing, and a big kind of trend in the neurodivergent space in general is like where specific people are at with them understanding their own, whether they've been diagnosed as a child or are seeking a diagnosis or are kind of self-diagnosed. There's a very broad spectrum of belief. So thank you for that. But you don't look autistic. A lot of times we create these stereotypes of what a neurodivergent person should look like. Oh, someone with ADHD is a white boy who's like bouncing off the walls and super hyperactive. And those sorts of like stereotypes, or whatever look autistic is, those just seek to like hurt, especially other minorities where there's that intersectionality. But then just in general, like it's not a helpful belief to have. It just diminishes someone's experience. It's the same as you saying like, oh, but you don't look Latino or you don't look Asian. Is like, how am I supposed to interpret that? Like, autism is just a different way in which my brain functions. It's not lesser. It's not like fundamentally wrong, or like it's not a good thing to be able to mask and to be able to present as neurotypical. A lot of times we hear people misusing these phrases, so we use them as adjectives. It's like, oh, you're a little, oh, I'm so OCD, oh, I'm so dyslexic, or like, oh, that person is, I feel they're autistic or whatever. And a lot of times when we use these phrases, we actually mean these. So for ADHD, when we talk about that in the common lexicon, just substituting these for like hyperactive or distractible. OCD is obsessive. Like I have some friends who have OCD, and I wouldn't say they're obsessive people. Yes, they have obsessions and compulsions related to their specific anxieties, but they're not obsessive in general. And I know other people who are very obsessive and controlling and like, I want it this particular way, where they don't have a neurological difference. They're neurotypical and don't have OCD. And so it's, just fundamentally different. Dyslexic is just having trouble reading, and then autistic is socially impaired. And all of these represent so much more than just this smaller aspect that sometimes we define it as. So what is, if that's all kind of what it's not, what is neurodiversity? So neurodivergence is like a language, and so like it's just one of the big things in the ADHD club and autistic circles is a communication difference. Differences. I speak Tagalog and English, and there are some things that are easier and simpler to say in Tagalog, and some things that are simpler and easier to say in English, and I can switch between the two. Obviously, I prefer English, but I can communicate with someone in their preferred style in Tagalog, and it feels a lot of times the same way. Or if I'm talking with a neurodivergent person, there are things that are just kind of easier to express because I don't have to use the normal route of all of these like social rules that are in the neurotypical community and stuff like that, or communication rules. Neurodiversity is cultural diversity. One thing that I've noticed in the year and a half that I've been in the neurodivergent community, and I've not only been in the community and been in the kind of ADHD community, the autistic and larger community as a whole, and had a lot of friends. My core friend group last year were all neurodivergent, and also diversity. Yeah, and I've done like a lot of research into all of these sorts of neurodivergences. It is a very strong interest of mine and something that I spend a lot of my free time looking at. So something that I've noticed is patience and social interactions. So people who are neurodivergent have broadly different ways of interacting. And so if I'm interacting with another neurodivergent person, and these are things that you can kind of work on too as you're interacting with neurodivergent people. So as I'm interacting, they might take a pause and like look at the wall, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be patient with that. I'm not going to read into that. Or I have my fidget cube, for example, And I might be fidgeting with it because it helps me better concentrate on the conversation. And so just like not making social expectations, not being like, hey, you need to look at me when I'm talking to you, because in neurotypical culture, looking at someone is paying attention, but in neurodivergent culture, paying attention and engaging with the conversation can look very different. And so just kind of having that patience, obviously it's not letting them do whatever, like if they obviously are zoned out and things like that, you can keep them in track and be like, hey, is there something that you might need? Is there a way that I can help you? Or realizing that, but at the same time recognizing that the way that neurodivergent people focus, socialize, communicate is going to be different. Explicit communication, this is another really big thing as well. So explicit communication is just kind of the difference between putting it all out there in the open and having like implied things. So one example is like, if you're like, oh, I'm really thirsty, and a neurodivergent person might be like, oh, thanks for letting me know. And you're like, no, what I meant was I want to go get water. And so that's like implicitly you're telling them like, oh, I want this thing, or like, oh, wow, it's a really nice day out. I sure love the weather. Like, it would be a shame if I stayed in my office all day. But for a lot of neurodivergent people, we're used to using, expressing things, both speaking and listening, in explicit ways. And so, and that same thing might come with questions, is like you kind of do something to infer something, and they just ask a follow-up question. And that's not like an emotional, that's not a loaded question, if you will. It could be just a sincere question. So, yeah, and then allowance for variance in method. So a lot of times people might have specific words that they might use, specific ways that they might want to communicate, and just being open with that. In the ADHD community specifically, there's a lot of like concurrent talking. So if I'm talking with someone, they might be like talking at the same time, or like do a little snippet, and that's just like a totally normal thing, is I'm listening and talking at the same time. Detours and tangents in conversation is like, there's a lot of, I picture it more as a conversation tree, where a neurotypical conversation is like, here's the start and here's the end, and we're gonna kind of follow this trail, and if we get sidetracked, we're gonna come back. In a neurodivergent, in an ADHD communication, it's like, we're building this tree of conversation together. We will follow whatever the coolest train of thought is. And sometimes when we try to do that as a person with ADHD, that's confusing for a neurotypical person. And sometimes if a neurotypical person came into a ADHD club, they'd be like, why are you guys talking about all of these different things? It's like you don't even have a topic of your conversation. And that's because we're following the conversation tree. Fidgeting and moving around, and so just kind of like not reading into someone if they want to stand up or want to walk around, that kind of thing. And then the pace of the conversation, sometimes really fast, sometimes it's like, oh, I want to know the etymology of this word, and then everybody starts Googling on their phone because you want to stop that pace until you're good to go. And then analogies and patterns is something that's very broadly used. I'm going to stop after the next slide and have you.
Wonderful. That's just what I was wondering.
Perfect. So cultural diversity with autism, a lot of times people who are autistic have special interests, and so a big part of it is like info dumping, is like, I'm going to share about my special interest, and as someone who's listening, I'm going to be really interested, and they might go on for 15 minutes talking about their special interests. I have a kid that I tutor who his special interests are Star Wars and sports and politics. I don't have any specific interest in any of those, but I like to listen and I like to let him express, and it's something that's fun for me, and realizing that a lot of times autistic people will have, instead of a broad range of kind of shallower interests, a very kind of contained range of super or special interests. Another thing is stimming, so there's echolalian and vocal stims, and then just kind of other types. So like the classic example is hand flapping, but there's also like spinning in a chair, or tapping your leg, thank you, Alexis, or like just kind of moving your body, or when you're really excited, like moving your body in some way to show your excitement. Another thing is using preferred communication styles. So this is something, especially with Alexis, that I do, but with a lot of different people, is like maybe maybe we're sitting right next to each other and we would prefer texting or messaging over Discord than talking in person, because that's the preferred method of communication, and that's totally chill in the autistic community. Another thing is sensory consideration. So you'll notice that Alexis oftentimes has her headphones on because she's like especially sensitive to sound, or right now you probably have glasses on because of fluorescent lights and it's really bright. Or just in general.
I just walked in from outside.
You're totally fine. But there's just like kind of different things that like autistic people will be aware of each other's sensory, like a lot more aware of each other's sensory considerations. And so be like, oh, do you need to be standing and walking during this conversation? Or like, are you understimulated? And like, do we need to go get something to eat so that you can be better? Or like, wow, it sounds like this room is really like too bright for you or really loud. Let's go to a different place so that you can kind of rest, and so that like the shoulders that go up, you can like relax. And that's a really big thing that autistic people are more aware of. So right now what I'm going to do is have both Molly and Alexis, just because we are running slightly short on time, I'm going to have both of you just share any of your experiences. Feel free to put the camera down as well.
That's okay. We got a handy dandy chair here.
Yeah, feel free to share. You're available until 10 as well, 10-ish, or you need to go soon. Yeah, so Molly, if you'd share your experience, just kind of with the autistic, with the neurodivergent community, and like, you know how to do this. I've given this presentation to you.
All right, so once again, I'm Molly. I am currently looking into ADHD. I am probably 85% certain that I have that, and I'm autistic. I haven't been formally diagnosed, but I have some other medical conditions where it's a statistically common thing to be autistic in association with that. So I just say that I'm autistic because it makes it easier for everybody, myself included. So I think the biggest part that I would like to, of sort of me being neurodivergent that I'd like to share with you today is the importance of letting people like discover things and then go from there. So I was homeschooled growing up, and so I kind of missed those key phases where you see the kid bouncing around in the classroom and you see them getting distracted and you see them not turning their homework in and all these other things where it just wasn't important in my education. And so I didn't see it until I got to a much more structured environment, or an environment where there was less flexibility for me to make my own adaptations, where it was really interesting because I had a mom who didn't really care about me turning in homework pages because she knew that I knew it, and she could talk to me about it. I also have dyscalculia, which is like number dyslexia, and my mom, when I was like doing my math homework, I wouldn't put how I got the answer, and so she'd, instead of requiring me to write down the actual math, she would let me like talk it out to her. And I was able to verbally explain it, and I just couldn't translate the math concepts into math symbols. And if I had been in a public school or another situation that required me to do so, I would have not gotten very far at all. I've always considered myself academically gifted. I feel like that's an accurate term. And even though the ways that I function in particularly a school setting are very different from a typical person's, it makes it so much easier. As sort of an example of this, it's been interesting because I have a friend of mine who is also autistic. We're in the same major, and neither of us realized it, but we both loved working on group projects together because we found that we didn't have to translate our thoughts into like a neurotypical language. And so our communication was about twice as fast as it would have normally been. People would watch our group and we'd get done at about the same time. It's not like we were some superhero team, but they just look at us and they go like, what? And then just keep on going. And having neurodivergence more accepted in spaces, and I mean, I don't mind weird looks, that's gotten me this far, but I wouldn't want that to be a deterrent for other people realizing that, hey, these communication methods that I've been seeing my whole life are not suited for me and I need something different. Where I didn't have to grow up in that space where I was conforming to that standard because it simply wasn't around. And that's been incredibly beneficial in my education. So I feel like as we implement a broader understanding, it will only benefit, and I cannot see a way that it will detract. Do need to head out, so I'm gonna run. But
Thank you.
yes, you're very welcome.
The slides are amazing too.
Thank you. Design is a special interest, so.
My own thoughts aren't quite as distilled, but just kind of some thoughts along the same lines. There have been studies on how accommodating people with like a broader range of needs ends up benefiting everyone in the long run. Like the bump pads in the sidewalks for blind people end up like allowing ramps as well as like not blanking on the example, but it's like if you have sensory needs like dimming the lights or switching to different lights that aren't as flickery like fluorescent tubes sometimes are, that can help people who like work in that space and get headaches and didn't realize that was why, or helping people to focus with lower sound levels. There are things that are common between the neurodivergent and neurotypical experience that the neurodivergent experience just has like amplified, and so helping accommodate those things that are harmful or different styles of approaches to a certain problem can help like everybody. But then also, since I didn't see the new version of the slides, if anyone has questions.
I'm going to go to the end and then have a time for questions. And I will work on representing Molly's experience and Alexis's and other neurodivergent people as well when we kind of jump into questions as well. So yeah, that's a really big thing. It's like the universal design is a really helpful thing. And one way that I've described it as well, just kind of going along with Alexis, thank you so much, is like the canary in the cavern is like everyone does actually have sensory needs. There is a point at which a neurotypical person is like, wow, this is too much sound, I need to get out of this space. But they also will be, if an autistic person who is hypersensitive to sound is in this space and they're like, wow, this is a lot of volume, this is a lot of sound, the neurotypical people around that will feel that distress as well. They just might not be able to key into that or recognize that. And so there's a lot of ways in which, or like for me, whenever someone gives a presentation, I will instantly know how they can make it more interesting, because I try to never give boring presentations, because I'm like, if I cannot focus on my own presentation with ADHD, I'm not going to want to give this presentation. And so like that's the sort of thing, is like there are things that I'm hyper aware where if the design were accommodated for me or like helped with how I interact with things, it would help with a broad range of kind of the spectrum of neurotypical experience as well. So now, how do we encourage belonging? What can we do at the Office of Belonging? One of the big things is I feel strongly that if we did like the same exact polls that we do for other minorities and other organizations on other like groups of people on campus, we would find some really vital and important information. One experience just in general is like struggling with general education classes, struggling to fit in, struggling to find community, and especially before the ADHD Club was founded. I've known so many people who come into the ADHD Club and they're like, wait, I didn't know there were people like me at BYU. I didn't know there were people that like had my same challenges or worked in the same way. Like I thought I was the only one. And that's one place where like I'm so happy that I was able to be here and help create this community, because these students deserve to feel belonging. They deserve to have that community. And especially during a really trying time when you kind of, at college, it's like, okay, the rug is swept from under your feet. You have no structure in your life. You have to make it all yourself. you have to feed yourself, clothe yourself, make money, like do all of these things, is like, it's very helpful to have a support group. And we have some Discord servers and Slack channels as well, that just like really, students just like give support and give advice and give help. And if teachers were more aware of the struggles that we face, they would be a lot, like if they had specific training or specific knowledge, that would be really, really helpful and vital for us. That's something that the UAC constantly struggles with, is they're like, yeah, we know that accommodations that by law people are required to have or would really help them, but teachers are just like, no, I do this way, or my class is a hard class and this many students fail, and you're like, why are you not trying to help all students succeed? Why are you not looking at this as, it's not very important that you finish all of the assignments perfectly to the T in which my brain works. We've all had those tests where it's like you have to read the professor's mind of like what they're trying to get. And for us, a lot of times it's like every single test is like, this test was not made for me, and so I'm going to study for it. Yeah, if you have an anecdote, please.
Speaking neurotypical is a second language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like trying to take a test in like Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like being able to have that universal design is super helpful, and like people who are specifically educated in how to help neurodivergent people and mentally struggling people is just a really, really beneficial thing. Yeah, and I actually have a friend who did her research project on how neurodivergent students struggle in school, and they're like these consistent things. She's doing a research project under folkloristics of like, hey, there's this broad community of neurodivergent people, and they have a lot of the same common struggles in school, and if only high school teachers would know these things of like how to help someone who like is neurodivergent, who is obviously doing something a different way. It's like, no, don't push them to do it the same way. It's like, yes, you can expect the same outcome, but don't expect them to do it the same way as you. So yeah, like any other kind of diversity, understanding the community, engaging with neurodivergent people respectfully. So it's like, you can't just ask any LGBT student like, oh, what are your thoughts on the LGBT community? What is your stance on this? Like, there are some students who want to advocate and who want to answer questions, but not everyone wants to talk about their experience. And so just like interacting respectfully, going to forums and panels and things like that, and info sessions, asking individuals for how you can support them. Because just like any kind of diversity, it's an individual thing. Everyone experiences their race or their ethnicity or their religion. They all experience it differently individually. And so ultimately for one neurodivergent person, yes, they might have a common experience or a common kind of shared culture, but the way that they experience it is going to be different. And so saying, hey, I noticed that you really struggle with getting things in on time or getting to our meetings on time. Like, is there a way that I can help? So that's both for Alexis and me, but then also interacting with other staff, and also like things that we can train further for like, if there's anything that you feel like you learned that you might interact differently with the neurodivergent community or with people who are neurodivergent, going and teaching other teachers and other staff members how to do that sort of thing. Educate ourselves. So one thing I love is following neurodivergent creators, asking questions, learning preferred terminology. So some people, especially in the like neurodivergent community, some people are like, I want to be called an autistic person because autism is inherently part of who I am and cannot be taken from my personhood. Or other people are like, no, I want to be a person with autism, like, or a person with Asperger's, or there's a broad range, or like, I like the word ADD, even though technically the word ADD isn't used in the DSM, the current like medical book. You can have a preferred style. So just like using their preferred diagnosis name, using people's preferred language is like, that's something that, and kind of like in the LGBT community where some people might reference themselves as queer or reference the community as the queer community as a reclaimed term. Some people aren't comfortable with that. So just kind of respecting that sort of thing is a big thing. And then what it might look like just kind of on a lower scale, so like for BYUSA or for different clubs or for different colleges is having accommodations. So So things like a sensory neutral room where students who are really sensory overwhelmed can go and chill. Allowing stimming in class or in communication is like not always requiring that like, hey, you need to look at me, or hey, like you, like don't be fidgeting, or oh, you have to be doing this specific kind of note taking or stuff like that. Like that just is less universally accessible and can be a really big struggle. Is like we only have so much emotional energy to expend, and if you're forcing us to take physical notes rather than on a laptop, even though we are going to pay attention, that's something that we're going to struggle with. And that's something that everyone has experienced, but a neurodivergent person might either have less emotional energy in total, and so struggle more, or just it might expend a lot more emotional energy to focus or to do things in the same way. Consideration, so things like event planning, is kind of the same as introverts versus extroverts, is like a lot of times in the church, kind of a lot of things are for an extrovert. Like missionary work is a very extroverted activity. I loved my mission because I got to be around someone 24/7. My little brother, he's an introvert, and he hated that aspect of a mission. And there are just a lot of things, either at BYU or just kind of in general, in the business world, there's a lot of extroverted things, and extroverts kind of tend to rise toward the top. But that's not necessarily the best thing, is allowing for events and allowing for other things where people who are neurodivergent can do what they do and do it well. Kind of like in the devotional, in the forum yesterday, is like people will have their specific things that they're really, really good at, and we should allow those people to do the things that they're really, really good at instead of expecting them to do all of these things that, oh, well, I might not be really good at communicating my words in typing or in texting or in talking or whatever it might be. And so just kind of allowing for that, and then like planning events that might be more inclusive to people who might want something chiller, like an online event or something like an event that's extremely spread around campus and not just all in one specific place, or just different kinds of things. And then community is supporting the clubs and communities on campus, making sure that they have access to the resources that they need, and study and support groups is like allowing for study groups and support groups to flourish at BYU,